Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Raanana. It's the week of May 7th, 2025, and the title of today's broadcast is Chaos in Raanana. Several of you wrote in over the past 48 hours or so with a question, and the question was about what happened at the local Reform temple here in Ra'anana. And if you're not aware of what happened, I'll give you some background. And I'm also going to give you a little bit of insight into the bigger picture that surrounds this, well, what some are calling an attempted pogrom. Gilad Kariv, who is a Reform rabbi himself and is a member of the Knesset, he called this an attempted pogrom, what happened last, I believe it was Tuesday night, Erev Yom HaZikaron. So here's the backstory. On Tuesday night, Erev Yom HaZikaron, which is Memorial Day here in Israel, there was an event held at the Reform Temple here in Ra'anana. There are a number of Reform temples throughout Israel. By no means would I say there are many. In general, Reform and conservative, what's called here Masoreti institutions, they do receive some funding from the government, but not nearly on the level that Orthodox institutions do. In any case, on Tuesday night, an event was held at the temple in Ra'anana. And it's an event that's been held around Israel for, I believe it's almost 20 years. It's an annual event that takes place on Erev Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day here in Israel. And at this event, families of Jews who've been killed, as well as families of Palestinians who've been killed, come together for a joint Memorial Day event. The only reason I know about this is because when I was writing my book, Israel 201, I was considering including a chapter about this event because it's a pretty unique thing that most people don't know about. So I interviewed several of the participants. I ended up not including the chapter, but I learned a lot about it. And really the bottom line, the gist of the event, the reason for doing this, the idea is that people from both sides have lost loved ones, family members over the course of Israel's history through terrorism, yes, but also innocent people have been killed by Israeli soldiers during raids in the West Bank, during operations in Gaza. And the idea behind the event is that if our two peoples are going to coexist, we need to honor the losses on both sides. And I think if you were to stop right there, most people, or most people in my audience who's listening right now, could probably see the value in this kind of event. Maybe you wouldn't agree that it should be held on Erev Yom HaZikaron, but in any case, there is some value to the idea of both sides coming together and remembering that both sides have lost loved ones. Where it gets dicey, however, is that from what I've heard, and also from good sources, I remember this from one of my interviews, some of the people who have attended these events in the past from the Palestinian side were families of suicide bombers who had participated in terrorism or other terrorists who had participated in terrorist acts against the Jews of Israel and who were subsequently killed. And so you can see why many people in Israel would find it deeply offensive that these two sides would come together and talk about mutual loss when even putting that aside, even putting aside the idea of families of terrorists attending, just the idea that both sides want something different. I am going to send out a message to everyone right now who is not muted on the live broadcast. Please go ahead and mute. I attempted to mute everyone through my host board. Apparently, not everyone is muted. So if you're not muted, please go ahead and mute right now. So in terms of the event itself, the two sides coming together, another troublesome angle is that the reason Israeli
My bread is
soldiers
done.
are
Oh,
doing
I
raids in
might
the
go
West
for the
Bank and the
gelato,
reason Israeli
but I don't
soldiers are
remember the
going
flavor.
into
I
Gaza
tell
is
you.
because the Palestinian side does not accept our existence and attacks us. And therefore, that the losses amongst the Palestinian people, that's collateral damage of operations that they themselves are starting. They are the catalyst for their own losses. That is how many people see it here, and that we cannot equate the two sides. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, is not a military of conquest, it's a military of defense.
Thanks.
And so the IDF would not even be in Gaza and would not be in the West Bank and Hebron and these other places were it not for terrorists who were actively planning to carry out attacks on the Jews of Israel. And by the way, for every terrorist attack that you hear about here in Israel, there are several dozen, maybe even hundreds that do not happen because they are caught ahead of time. So the idea that to say that Palestinians who've been killed by the IDF, that you can equate that loss with IDF soldiers or with victims of terror who've been killed, many find that troubling because it's the side of the attacker. And if they are attacking us with terrorism and some of their own happen to die as we are trying to defend ourselves, that those kind of losses aren't the same as the losses we experience on our side. I'll leave it up to you for you to decide where you stand. But what I want to do now is just give you some of the bigger context of what this story is. So, what happened on Tuesday night? This event was being held at the Reform Temple here in Raanana. And a group of rioters, right wing rioters, showed up outside. And if it had only been carrying signs or chanting, maybe you could legitimize it. But they got physical. They threw firecrackers and stones at the synagogue. They assaulted participants, including elderly people. Uh, they assaulted police officers when the police officers tried to protect those who were inside. And that is why Gilad Kariv, this member of Knesset, who's also a Reform rabbi, referred to this as an attempted pogrom. You can see, you can see his point. These were people inside who, no matter where you fall on this issue, I think we can agree that people sitting together in the same room should be allowed. And so the minute they are attacked for sitting together in the same space, you can see why Kariv would call this a pogrom. And people were injured. Officers were injured. This was an attack. We don't want to mince words here. And it was attack for the most part of Jews on Jews, as well as some of the Palestinians who were in the room. So that's the background. I guess what you should also know is that this was organized by right-wing politicians and political figures. So there was definitely a grassroots element to the organization, but there were also right-wing politicians involved. And so, that raises that's very problematic as I see it when you have politicians of your own country organizing a physical attack on citizens of that country. That's very problematic. And they made clear that this was just, I think the words they used were that this is just the opening salvo, that this is the first of many other attacks to come should both sides try to come together. Now, I can see how many of us, especially from Western liberal democracies, would find this kind of attack of Jews on fellow Jews, as well as on Palestinians, as reprehensible, as abhorrent. That the right to assembly, the right to sit in the same space together, people should not be attacked for doing so. I will tell you, though, the feeling here in Israel is not so cut and dried. And that's what this podcast is all about, to show you the Israeli perspective. And this is one example of where the Israeli perspective differs, maybe even drastically, from that of maybe the American Jewish population and certainly the population at large. Now, to be clear, there are definitely Israelis who find this attack abhorrent and reprehensible and dangerous. But what you might not be aware of is how many Israelis actually are on the side of the attackers. And maybe they don't feel the attackers should have gone so far and been physical, but they can agree with the point of view of the attackers. And let me walk you through that logic, the way they see it. The way they see it, Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, is specifically set aside to remember IDF soldiers who've been killed in battle and in training in defense of the state and victims of terrorist attacks. That is the purpose of Yom HaZikaron. So already problem number one is that when you introduce this other population into the Yom HaZikaron memorial, this population of Palestinians who've been killed, that is already goes against the idea of what this holiday is all about. Maybe not holiday, day of commemoration. The second and bigger issue is that this took place in state-funded space, in a synagogue that is funded by the state. Now, as I said before, the Reform Temple does not receive nearly as much funding as Orthodox institutions do in Israel. But still, the Reform Temple does receive funding from the government as a Jewish institution. And the idea that a state-funded institution would house the screening of a movie and a conversation between family members who've lost Jews throughout our 77-year history and family members of Palestinians who've lost family members, that this should not be taking place on state-backed property. This is not an idea of the state. If they want to hold this in a living room, if they want to rent out a private space and hold this kind of meet on their own, with their own funding, then maybe that would be more acceptable. But the idea that this is now a state-sponsored event, that the country is literally helping to fund this kind of event where some of the participants might be family members of terrorists who were killed or even murderers who were killed. That is what the protesters were mainly protesting. And when you think about it from that perspective, I can kind of agree with them. Not that they were violent and not that they went as far as they did. They shouldn't have crossed the line. They shouldn't have entered the building. They shouldn't have been physical at all. But I can certainly understand their point of view is that the state of Israel on Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, should not be helping to sponsor this kind of event where some of the participants might be the families of terrorists who have actually harmed or killed Jews. There is one other issue that I want to bring in here, which is sort of an ancillary issue, tangential, but I think is very important to understand if you want to understand Israel at large. I've talked before about this, but it's worth bringing up again, is the absolute lack of police presence here in Israel and the absolute lack of police coordination here in Israel. The police were notified ahead of time, not only of this conversation between Jews and Palestinians at the Reform Temple, but they were informed that there was likely going to be a riot and possibly violence because there were calls on social media, including Facebook, in Raanana, to come out to the protest, and some violent language was used, language which made it clear that this protest, this riot, could get violent against against those having the conversation inside. So the police were notified ahead of time. And yet, two things happened. First of all, not nearly enough police officers showed up at the event to provide the kind of protection that was needed. And once the riot broke out, the police, for the most part, at least at the beginning, were largely helpless. They really didn't know what to do and were caught off guard. And to me, it's really important to listeners around the world who are not in Israel to understand that our relationship with the police here in Israel is Very different from your relationship with the police in other countries, certainly in the US. It makes me chuckle that a few years ago there was this whole movement to defund the police in the United States. Well, let me tell you, that's how Israel is right now. We don't fund the police. We don't have nearly enough police officers. They don't have nearly enough organization and power to do the kinds of things they need to do to keep the country safe. I think I've mentioned this before, but it's actually something I talk in my stand-up act as well, is how you really won't get driving tickets here in Israel. I remember in the US on the highway, I would always watch my speed limit. And every time I go back, I have to remind myself to watch the speed limit because there could be cops hidden behind, the billboard or under the overhead pass with a radar gun watching you. I can count on one hand the number of times in the past 9 years that I've lived here that I've seen a police officer at the side of the highway with a radar gun here in Israel. We just don't have the manpower. We don't have the manpower to make it expendable that we can send officers out into the highways to clock the speeds of drivers and motorists. And you see it show up in the driving all the time. Motorcycles drive on the sidewalk, people blow stop signs. I wouldn't even say that people blow stop signs here. I don't think I've ever seen anyone completely stop at a stop sign unless it's a teenager taking driving lessons and his or her driving instructor is in the car with them. Then they will stop and they will follow the rules. But otherwise, stop signs are pretty much glorified yield signs. They sort of warn you to slow down and take a look at the intersection, but nobody actually stops. Um, you know, Cars will drive in reverse down one-way streets. They'll even drive the wrong way down a one-way street. That's happened to me that I've seen someone coming at me the wrong way down a one-way street, and it wasn't an accident, but it was they just didn't want to have to wait in line as they came out of their driveway to go all the way that way, so they just went the wrong way down the one-way street toward me. And there's no police presence to back it up. There's no fear of the police here. There's no calculation. There's no calculus that I don't know if I should do this move because I could get a ticket. It just doesn't happen. You'll get parking tickets on certain days of the week, and sometimes the police will, as we say, davka, go out of their way to give tickets at certain times when people park illegally. But for the most part, people park knowing that there's not a lot of police presence, which is why you'll see cars parked on the sidewalk or in places that aren't allowed, simply because there isn't that manpower to back it up. I was in the States this past week, and I saw something that so clearly drove home the idea of this lack of police presence. There was a school bus that stopped along a very busy street. And of course, all the traffic in the US stopped because when a school bus stops in the US, that little stop sign flips out of the side and people stay back. They stop for about 100 or 200 feet in either direction. In Israel, when, there aren't really big school buses, but there are certainly school vans that carry maybe 10 to 12 kids at a time. When those pull over to let kids out, cars will drive around them and go into the other lane of traffic in order to go around them and avoid getting stuck behind them. That's just the Israeli way, the Israeli mentality. And there simply is not a police force here to enforce the rules of the road or really to enforce anything else. So I am not surprised. I'm horrified, but I'm not surprised when I found out that the police were notified that this event was taking place in Raanana and that not nearly enough officers showed up, and that when the riot broke out, they didn't really know what to do. The police here in general are seen as kind of tame, not being able to do much. They don't have a lot of bite. People argue with police officers in ways that you never would in the U.S. And so that's another angle of the story that I really thought it was important for you to know about, that maybe this could have been prevented or certainly wouldn't have been as bad as it had the police acted the way police in a normal country would. But when it comes to police here, like in Ra'anana, we don't even have a police force. It was the police of Kfar Saba, which is next door, that were responsible for this event. We don't have a police force in Raanana. If you need help, there's a certain city hall number you can call, and they'll send over what's called Moked, which is kind of like city services. But We don't have a police force of our own. And to me, that's one of the things. There are a few things that really stand out and bother me about life in Israel, and this lack of a police force is one of them. For me, that's hard, especially coming from, a Western society where the police were integral to the community that I grew up in. I hope I shed some light on this event from the past week and showed you that it's not nearly as black and white as we might see it from the point of view of like I said, a Western liberal, democracy in the U.S. You can really see how Israelis would be disturbed by the idea of a joint Jewish and Palestinian event taking place on Memorial Day, which really is the most sacred day on the calendar here in Israel. That kind of event would take place in general, but even more specifically on state-funded property. Obviously they went too far being violent, but I can certainly sympathize, especially families who've lost soldiers, God forbid, or lost family members to terrorism. You can sympathize with their point of view that the state should not be helping to put these events on, certainly not on Yom HaZikaron. A couple other things I want to quickly run by you just from the past week. This morning, I was woken up by the missile that came from Yemen around 9:30 in the morning Israel time. What's not from the missile itself, but from the sirens that woke me up. I'm a little bit jet lagged. I just returned from Israel. I returned from the United States to Israel last night, and so I was sleeping in today when these sirens went off. What was significant about this morning's siren is that this missile actually made impact. This missile actually landed near Ben Gurion Airport in outside of Tel Aviv. For a while now, the number one target of the Houthis, one of the number one targets, has been Ben Gurion Airport, and they managed to come pretty close, close enough that many flights were canceled subsequently. My friend Benji Lovett is supposed to fly tomorrow, and his flight has already been delayed and possibly canceled. Uh, and this raises a big question among Israelis: is why is this Houthi force still managing to disrupt our days like they are? Why are we simply not taking them out? And it leads to this bigger idea of the questions we have. Why are we back in Gaza and losing soldiers? We lost 2 IDF soldiers over the weekend. Why are we there? What is our mission? People are saying, what is our mission right now? Netanyahu himself said the mission is to defeat Hamas. And right after that, the chief of staff of the army said, no, the mission is to free the hostages. So we don't even have agreement between the prime minister and the chief of staff as to what our mission is. We don't know why these Houthis, this ragtag force that's funded by Iran, why have we not destroyed their infrastructure already? Why are they still able to attack us? Why does Iran still have the power it does? Many Israelis felt that we would have attacked Iran by now and taken out their nuclear capabilities. We don't seem to be doing that. So it just raises this idea of many questions. And why are our outside enemies still able to disrupt our life here? We're now well over a year and a half. Actually, in this week, the day that this podcast drops, will be the 19-month anniversary of, is it 20 months anniversary? I believe it's actually 20-month anniversary of October 7th. How is it that we are still fighting this war, that we still have hostages there in Gaza, and we don't even have a clear plan, a clear mission that's being communicated to us, the people? So that's what's on Israelis' minds right now, and we really don't know what the summer is going to look like. Usually summer, we're looking forward to it. School is out. It's a time of celebration, good moods, family vacations. There are so many questions on our minds right now that we really don't know what this summer is going to shape up into and is going to be. One last point I want to raise is about the fires we experienced in Israel on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. A couple of you wrote in with questions: were these fires caused by arson? And there's really 2 answers to this. On the one hand, we don't know for sure how the first fire started. It may have been arson, but I don't think that's been confirmed. What we do know for sure is that subsequent fires were started by arson amongst West Bank Palestinians for the most part. That there were calls on social media to come on out, and we caught a number of suspects. I think 18 suspects were arrested, many of them with matches and cotton and other materials to start these fires. So while we still don't know how the initial blaze began, there was definitely arson involved at very quickly. And it reminds me very much of the story of King Solomon from the Bible when the two women come to Solomon with the baby and both claim that the baby is theirs. And Solomon says, wisely, I'll cut the baby in half and you can each have half. And so the woman who is not the true mother says, yes, do this. That's fine. I'll take half the baby. And the true mother of the baby says, no, I'd rather the other woman have it. Keep the baby whole and alive. And that's how Solomon knows who the real mother is. This idea that if you truly love the baby or a place, you would not mistreat it. And so, one point that Israelis are bringing up this week is if the whole argument is that Palestinians want to return to the land and love this land so much, why are they setting it on fire and destroying the land? When you love the land, you do not treat the land the way that they did. That is where we are right now in Israel. I thank you all for joining me on Inside Israel. Some of you have written in that you can't always make the live broadcast. I want to let you know that the recording of the video always goes up within 24 hours on my website. That's at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. It's also on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, just look for @JoelChasnoff. That's my YouTube handle. And the audio drops on Wednesdays on Apple and Spotify. So if you don't subscribe there, I encourage you to do so. That way, when you're on the go, you can always hear Inside Israel wherever you are. Thank you so much for your questions this week, both about the fires and about the incident in Raanana. It gave me the impetus to dedicate pretty much the entire episode to it. I look forward to more questions from you, and I will see you for the live broadcast next week, same time, May 11th, Sunday at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. It's occurring to me as I speak that could be Mother's Day, and if it is, maybe I would back that up to a little bit later in the day. But in any case, you can always see the recording on the website. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Lehitraot from here in Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. I'll leave the chat open a few more minutes in case any of you want to stay in touch with each other.